They came for her with 9 men and enough rope. They left with 3 men unconscious in the dirt, 6 more limping for the county doctor, and a legend that would outlive every property record ever burned. This is a story passed down through generations of Iron Rose, a woman built like she was carved from the same red Georgia clay, and the single night in 1832 when 9 armed men learned that some souls simply cannot be broken. Stay with us, because what she did in that yard and what she did in the 11 hours that followed is the kind of history that was never supposed to survive. This story is for educational and informational purposes, focusing on documented resistance during the 1832 Georgia. We aim to honor the forgotten stories of those who fought against injustice. Welcome to Stiatidi Dio Tyranni, where history's forgotten stories are brought back to life. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from by commenting with your city and the current time. If you enjoy uncovering hidden chapters of history, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue sharing these remarkable stories and introduces them to more people around the world. Now let's dive into today's story. Long before that night, before the torches and the rope and the 9 men who thought they understood what they were dealing with, there was simply a girl growing into something the property had no name for. She was born, as the story is told, among the descendants of that land, sometime around 1805 in the red dirt hill country of central Georgia. Her mother named her Martha, a plain name for what everyone who met her would come to understand was anything but a plain woman. By the time she was 14, the other women working on the property had already started calling her by a different name behind the supervisor's back. Not out of cruelty, out of awe. Iron Rose. Iron because nothing about her seemed to bend the way the world wanted it to. Rose because for all her strength, there was a softness in her that never left. The way she hummed to the children in the quarters at night, the way she carried water for the elders before she carried it for herself. Martha's mother, according to the fragments of a story that survived, had come to that property as a girl herself, one of the last generation to arrive before the laws changed in 1808. She died when Martha was still young, leaving behind little but a handful of half-remembered songs and an aunt named Naomi, who would go on to shape so much of who Martha eventually became. What Martha inherited from her mother's memory, passed down second hand through Naomi's retelling, was a sense that the world she had been born into was not the only world that had ever existed. Somewhere across an ocean she would never see, there had been a life where her family's strength, her family's size, her family's fierce protectiveness had been a source of pride and status. That knowledge, small as it was, mattered more than the property could have understood. It gave Martha something to stand on besides the ground she worked. A sense, however fragile, that she came from somewhere, from someone, that the men in charge had no claim to. She stood, by every account, passed mouth to mouth across those hills for 100 years, close to 6 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, with hands that could close around a grown man's forearm and leave bruises shaped like fingers for a week. But it wasn't the size alone that made men uneasy around her. It was the stillness, the way she watched, the way she waited, because Martha had learned early and violently that a woman built like her was seen as a threat before she ever raised a hand. The supervisor noticed her before she turned 15. Not with kindness, with calculation. Big, strong, capable of picking more cotton in a day than 2 men combined. They worked her harder than anyone and gave her the hardest consequence for the crime of surviving it. The first time they disciplined her, she was young. The offense, according to the story handed down through the quarters, was slowness. Though anyone who watched her work knew, there was nothing slow about Martha. She had stopped for perhaps 30 seconds to help a boy half her size who had collapsed in the heat. 30 seconds cost her a severe consequence. She did not cry out, not once. The supervisor that day, a man named Silas Boone, would later tell other white men on neighboring properties that the girl's silence unsettled him more than any sound could have. He said it was like striking stone. That silence became her armor. Year after year, consequence after consequence, Martha Johnson learned to fold her pain into somewhere the supervisor could never reach. And somewhere in that folding, something else was growing. Something patient. Something that understood, long before that night in the yard, that the day would come when folding wasn't going to be enough anymore. The harsh treatment did not stop when she was young. They came again and again when she was accused of talking back to a mistress who had wrongly accused her of taking a hair. Calm. They came again when she refused to hand over a blanket meant for her ailing grandmother during a cold snap that took 2 infants in the quarters. That winter. Each time, Martha absorbed what was done to her the same way. Silent, still, her eyes fixed somewhere past the man in charge, as though she were already somewhere else entirely. The other workers noticed something else about her too, something that had nothing to do with consequence. She never let the hardship turn her hard toward the people around her. Where some survivors of that kind of repeated hardship grew guarded, even distant in their own exhaustion, Martha only grew more devoted to the people she loved. She carried sick children on her back to the healer's cabin without being asked. She gave up her own meager rations more than once so an elder wouldn't go hungry. She sat up through the night with women in labor, humming low songs that existed only in the memory of the people who heard them. It was this combination, the iron and the rose, the 2 halves of a name the quarters eventually settled on for her, that made her impossible to categorize. The supervisor wanted her to be either broken or defiant, quiet or rebellious, because those were the only 2 boxes their understanding of a worker on that property could hold. Martha was neither. She was something they had no framework for at all, and that more than her size or her strength was what would eventually undo them. Now here's where the story takes its first hard turn, because everything you've heard so far is only the surface. The real transformation happened somewhere the record keepers never wrote down, in the years between that first consequence and the confrontation that would make her a legend. We'll get to the yard. We'll get to the 9 men. But first you need to understand exactly what kind of storm was building underneath that stillness. Because when it finally broke, nobody on that property would ever describe confrontation the same way again. The property Martha lived and labored on sat along the fall line of central Georgia, in a stretch of country where the soil turned from Piedmont clay to sandy coastal plain. Land greedy owners had only recently forced into cotton production. It was brutal country to farm and brutal country to survive in as a worker on that property, because the property owner, a man remembered in the oral history only as Master Klein, had built his fortune on speed and volume. More cotton, faster, at any human cost. Klein employed 9 white overseers to manage roughly 140 enslaved men, women, and children across 3 separate fields. 9 men whose entire purpose was to extract more labor from bodies that had nothing left to give, and to do it through fear. Among the worker community, each of those 9 men had a reputation, whispered from cabin to cabin after dark. There was Boone, harsh treatment happy and quick-tempered. There was a heavy, set man named Garrett Voss, who liked to use his fists instead of the whip, claiming it built character. There was a lean, quiet one named Thomas Ridley, who everyone feared more than the loud ones, because cruelty that doesn't raise its voice is the hardest kind to see coming. Martha worked under all of them at different points across the years, and by the time she reached her mid-20s, she had become something the supervisor didn't have a word for. She was by then the strongest laborer on the property, male or female. She could load a cotton wagon that took 2 men to load. She could carry sacks of grain that would stagger a mule. And she had never, not once in over a decade, attempted to run, attempted to fight back, or shown anything but that same folded, patient silence. They mistook that patience for submission. That was their first mistake. What they didn't know, what nobody outside the quarters knew, was that Martha had spent those years doing more than surviving. She had spent them watching, studying the rhythms of the supervisor, learning which ones drank before their shift and grew slow and careless, learning which ones favored their right side because of an old injury, learning the layout of every field, every fence line, every stretch of forest bordering the property, because in the back of her mind, in the deepest part of the fold where her pain lived, she had never once accepted that this was the whole of her life. Her aunt, an elder in the quarters named Naomi, was the one who first taught her something the supervisor would never have imagined a docile woman like Martha was capable of learning: the mechanics of the human body. Naomi had been a healer back before she was stolen from the coast of West Africa as a young woman, and she carried with her knowledge of anatomy that had nothing to do with medicine alone. She knew where a strike could drop a grown man in a single motion. She knew how leverage could turn a smaller body into a weapon against a larger one. She knew that strength was not always about size. It was about precision timing and the willingness to commit fully to a single devastating motion. Late at night, in the narrow space between the cabins, Naomi taught Martha these things in silence, using nothing but hushed words and careful demonstration. Not fighting for sport, fighting for the day survival demanded. You will not always have a choice about when it comes, Naomi told her, according to the story as it has always been passed down. But you will have a choice about whether you are ready. The lessons began small. Naomi would grip Martha's wrist and have her practice turning out of the hold, using nothing but the rotation of her own forearm over and over until the movement stopped feeling like an effort and started feeling like breathing. She taught her how a person's eyes betray their next move half a second before their body does. How a man about to swing high will glance, almost involuntarily, at the spot he intends to hit. She taught her to fall without injury, to roll instead of crash, because a fight is rarely a single blow. It is a sequence. And the person left standing at the end is usually the one who wasted the least energy along the way. Naomi also taught her something that had nothing to do with strikes or holds at all: the discipline of stillness. Anger fights loud, she would say. It swings wide, and it swings tired. What you carry quiet, and quiet never gets tired. Martha absorbed this the way she absorbed everything, without a word, without a flicker of expression, filing it away in the same folded place where she kept everything else the property had tried to take from her. Some nights the lessons were physical. Other nights, Naomi simply talked about the coast she had come from, about a warrior tradition of women in her home village who had trained for exactly this kind of moment generations before either of them had ever set foot on Georgia soil. She described women who trained alongside the men of their community, who were entrusted with the defense of their villages during raids, whose strength and skill were celebrated rather than feared. She spoke of ceremonies she remembered only in fragments now, of songs sung before a fight that were meant to call on the strength of every woman who had ever stood her ground before you. Much of what Naomi carried with her had been worn thin by decades of forced separation from the culture that shaped it, fragments reassembled from memory rather than an unbroken tradition. But fragments, she always told Martha, were enough. A fragment carried forward is still a whole thing passed on. It only becomes lost when no one bothers to carry it at all. She told Martha that the strength inside her hadn't been invented on this property. It had been carried across an ocean, passed down through blood and memory, waiting for someone to need it badly enough to let it out. Martha listened. Martha trained quietly, patiently for years, never once revealing what she was building inside herself. She practiced in the dark, using nothing but a sack of grain hung from a low branch, striking it in the precise, silent way Naomi had shown her until her knuckles hardened and her instincts sharpened. She learned to read a man's balance by the way his shoulders shifted. She learned that the throat, the knee, and the base of the skull were doorways, not obstacles. She learned to breathe through fear instead of freezing inside it. And she waited because a storm that arrives too early gets extinguished. A storm that waits for its moment becomes something no one can stop. There is a detail in the oral history that always draws a reaction from those hearing the story for the first time. Naomi died 2 winters before the confrontation in the yard, never living to see the night her teachings would be tested. But those who tell the story insist that in the seconds before Martha moved against Voss, witnesses swore they saw her lips shape a single word, too quiet to carry across the yard. A name, Naomi's name, spoken like a promise being kept at last. That moment was closer than anyone knew, because down in the lower fields, tension had been building for months. A poor harvest the year before. A new supervisor determined to prove his cruelty could match the others, and the property owner increasingly paranoid about the whispers of rebellion spreading across Georgia and South Carolina following the trials that had gripped the South just months earlier. Newspapers Klein received from Charleston and Savannah carried increasingly alarmed reports of enslaved unrest across the region, and men like him responded to that fear the only way they knew how: by tightening their grip, by making examples, by convincing themselves that more violence, not less, was the answer to a system that was never as stable as they wanted to believe. What none of them understood, what none of them could have understood, blinded as they were by their own certainty, was that the very cruelty they relied on to maintain control was, in Martha's case, quietly manufacturing the one thing capable of ending it. Every lash, every stolen ration restored only through defiance. Every night spent training in secret between the cabins. All of it was compounding year after year into a reckoning none of the 9 men about to face her could have possibly predicted. Fear makes cruel men crueler, and in the autumn of 1832, that cruelty was about to collide with a woman who had spent her entire life preparing not to break. The incident that finally set everything in motion began, as these things so often do, with something small. A young boy named Elias, the son of one of the field hands, had been caught trying to sneak an extra ration of cornmeal to his younger sister, who had been sick for days, with a fever that wouldn't break. Under Klein's rules, that was theft, and theft, under Garrett Voss's particular brand of discipline, meant a public harsh treatment in the yard as an example to the rest of the quarters. Martha had known Elias since the day he was born. She had carried him on her hip as an infant while his mother worked the fields. She had taught him to tie knots, to whistle bird calls, to find shade on the worst days of summer. When word reached her that Voss intended to whip the boy half to death over a handful of cornmeal meant for a sick child, Something in her that had been folded for 20 years began, for the first time, to unfold. Word of the harsh treatment spread through the quarters that morning the way bad news always did. Fast, quiet, mouth to mouth. Faster than any supervisor could have tracked. By the time the sun was high enough to bring the whole property out into the yard, nearly every enslaved worker on the property had heard some version of what was about to happen, and nearly every one of them felt the same helpless dread settle into their chest. An 11-year-old boy, already thin from the same hunger that had made his sister sick, was about to be disciplined in front of everyone he knew, and there was nothing any of them could do about it. That was the property's oldest lesson, drilled into every enslaved person from the moment they were old enough to understand it. Watch and do nothing, or the punishment spreads. Martha heard the news while she was hauling water near the smokehouse. She did not set the buckets down slowly. She did not pause to think it through. Something in her simply moved. The way a held breath finally releases, and by the time her mind caught up with her body, she was already walking toward the yard. She did not rush. She did not scream. She walked calm as still water into the yard, where Voss had Elias's wrists bound to the discipline post. The other supervisor gathering to watch as they always did, treating punishment like theater. Dozens of workers had already gathered at the edges of the yard, forced there by the supervisor as an audience, their faces carefully arranged into the practiced blankness that survival demanded, even as their hearts pounded with a dread only the powerless truly understand. Elias's mother stood among them, held back by another worker's hand on her arm, tears streaking silently down her face, forbidden by the threat of her own punishment from making a sound. Voss raised the whip for the first strike, taking his time, drawing the moment out for the audience the way he always did, savoring the fear in the yard the way another man might savor a good meal. That was when Martha stepped out from the edge of the crowd. "Let the boy go," Martha said. Just 4 words, but something in the way she said them made the yard go quiet. Voss laughed. He told her to get back to the fields before she earned herself the same treatment. He raised the whip, and Martha Johnson closed the distance between them in 3 long strides and caught the whip mid-swing, wrapping it once around her forearm and yanking it clean out of his hand. The silence that followed lasted maybe 2 full seconds. Then it broke into chaos. Here's the part of the story that's been told 1,000 different ways around 1,000 different fires, and we're about to walk through it exactly as it happened, moment by moment, because what took place in the next several minutes in that property yard would become the single most talked about act of resistance in that county's history. Meanwhile, don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's continue. 9 armed men, 1 woman, and a fight that nobody who witnessed it ever fully forgot. Before we walk through what happened in that yard, it's worth knowing exactly who Martha was facing, because the sheer mismatch of it is part of what makes the story impossible to look away from. Garrett Voss, the man who started it, was the property's most senior supervisor, a man in his 40s who had spent 2 decades building a reputation for brutality across 3 different counties. Thomas Ridley, quiet and calculating, had once served briefly in a state militia and was, by every account, the only one of the 9 with any real combat experience before that day. Silas Boone, the same man who had disciplined Martha as a young woman, was known across the quarters as quick, tempered and impulsive, more dangerous for his unpredictability than his skill. The remaining 6 were younger men, hired more recently, eager to prove themselves in front of the veterans they worked alongside, the exact kind of men most likely to escalate a situation rather than de-escalate it, desperate not to be the one who hesitated in front of the others. Combined, the 9 men carried at least 2 pistols, 1 musket, several coiled lengths of rope, and in Boone's case, the very whip he had just raised against an 11-year-old boy. Against them stood one woman, unarmed, 27 years old, whose only weapons were 2 decades of swallowed pain, and a body Naomi had spent years quietly, patiently turning into something these men had no framework to understand. By every rational measure, what happened next should not have been possible. For a moment, nobody in that yard moved at all. 9 supervisors stood scattered around the harsh treatment post, muskets and pistols holstered, rope coiled at their belts, utterly unprepared for the idea that the woman standing before them intended to do anything but stand there and take whatever came next the way she always had. That single beat of disbelief, no more than a second or 2, was the only advantage Martha was ever going to get, and every hour of training in the dark with Naomi had taught her not to waste it. Voss lunged first, furious at the humiliation of having his own whip torn from his hand in front of the other supervisors and dozens of watching workers. He was a big man, built like a barrel, and he came at Martha with both hands aiming for her throat, the classic mistake of a man who has never in his life had to fight someone who refused to be afraid of him. Martha didn't retreat. She stepped into him, a move that shocked everyone watching, because every instinct in a threatened person screams to back away. Instead, she pivoted her hips, drove her shoulder into his sternum, and used his own forward momentum against him, sending Voss crashing backward into the dirt with enough force to knock the wind clean out of his lungs. It was the first lesson Naomi had ever taught her. Never fight a bigger man's strength. Fight his balance. Voss hit the ground hard enough to raise a small cloud of red dust, and, for a moment, he simply lay there, staring up at the sky, unable to remember how to fill his lungs. It was the sound that broke the paralysis gripping the rest of the yard, the sound of the loudest, cruelest man on the property reduced in an instant to a wheezing heap in the dirt. Somewhere at the edge of the crowd, someone history has never recorded who let out a single sharp gasp of astonishment, quickly smothered. The other supervisor, who had been standing in stunned disbelief for those first few seconds, finally moved. Boone drew a length of rope, shouting for the others to surround her. Thomas Ridley, the quiet one, pulled a pistol from his belt, but in the chaos of bodies closing in, he couldn't get a clean line of fire without risking hitting one of his own men. That hesitation was the second gift Martha's years of watching had earned her. She knew, without having to think about it, that a crowd of men trying to subdue one target in close quarters becomes its own obstacle. Bodies get in the way of guns. Fists get in the way of ropes. Panic makes men clumsy. 2 supervisors grabbed for her arms from either side. She let them get close deliberately, the way Naomi had drilled into her, and then dropped her weight low and drove upward, using the combined leverage of both their grips against them, flipping one man clean over her hip and sending him crashing into a third supervisor who had been rushing in from behind. 3 men went down in a single motion, a tangle of limbs and curses in the red dirt. It happened so fast that several witnesses would later disagree, when the story was retold around cabin fires in the years that followed, about the exact order the men fell in. What nobody disagreed on was the sound, the sharp percussive impact of 3 grown men colliding at once, the kind of sound that seemed to hang in the air a moment, longer than it should have, as though even the yard itself needed a second to understand what it had just witnessed. A 4th man, younger, newer to the job than the others, made the mistake of trying to tackle her from behind. Martha felt him coming. She had learned to read the shift of weight in the ground beneath her feet. The way Naomi always said a hunted animal learns to hear danger before it sees it. And she dropped her center of gravity at the last possible instant, sending him sailing over her shoulder to land hard on his back, all the air driven from his chest in one violent exhale. He did not get back up. He lay there in the dirt, staring at the sky, blinking hard, the fight already over for him, even though it had barely begun. By now, the yard had descended into pandemonium. Supervisors shouting orders that contradicted each other. One screaming for rope, another screaming for the others to shoot, a third simply screaming, unable to form words at all, workers frozen at the edges, some in terror, some quietly, carefully beginning to understand they were witnessing something that would be spoken of for the rest of their lives. Elias's mother had gone entirely still, one hand pressed over her mouth, watching the woman who had once carried her son on her hip, now standing at the center of a storm nobody on that property had ever imagined possible. Boone finally got the rope around one of her wrists. For a moment, it looked as though the numbers were beginning to tell. 4 men still standing, closing in from multiple directions, Ridley circling with the pistol raised, waiting for a clean shot. It was by every account the most dangerous point in the entire fight, the single moment where things could have gone very differently. 4 able-bodied men, one of them armed with a musket. He hadn't yet had a clear opportunity to fire, closing a circle around the woman with a rope already looped around one wrist. Any hesitation now, any moment of doubt or fear allowed to surface, would have been the opening they needed to finally bring her down. This was the moment the storytellers always say, where Martha Johnson stopped fighting like a woman defending herself and started fighting like a woman who had already decided she would rather die than be dragged back to that post. She turned into Boone's grip instead of away from it, closing the distance so fast the rope went slack in his hands, and drove her elbow into the side of his jaw with a crack that several witnesses would later describe as the loudest sound in the whole encounter. Boone dropped where he stood. 2 men remained upright besides Ridley, along with the boy still bound to the post, watching everything with wide, disbelieving eyes. One of them, seeing 3 of his colleagues unconscious or writhing in the dirt in under a minute, made the only rational decision left to him and turned to run for the main house to call for reinforcements. The last man standing between Martha and the post made his stand with a wooden club, swinging hard at her skull. She caught the blow on her forearm. Story says she wore the bruise for weeks afterward, dark and swollen, a mark of that single moment of pain she allowed herself to feel, and answered with a strike to his throat that put him on his knees, gasping, unable to draw breath. That left only Ridley and the pistol he had been waiting the entire fight to use. We're not done. Not even close. Because what happened between Martha and Thomas Ridley in the final seconds of that confrontation is the part of the story that turned a fight into a legend, and what she did immediately after is the part almost nobody talks about, but should. Thomas Ridley was by every account the most dangerous of the 9, not because he was the strongest or the fastest, but because he was the only one who had kept his composure through the entire chaos. While the others swung wild and grabbed blind, Ridley had circled the fight patiently, pistol raised, waiting for the one clean second when Martha's body wasn't shielded by one of his own men. That second finally arrived. Martha had just freed Elias's wrists from the post, and for one fatal instant her back was turned toward Ridley, her body still unguarded. He raised the pistol. What happened next depends on which version of the story you hear. Passed down through generations of oral history, shaped and reshaped by every mouth that carried it forward. But the version told most consistently, the one that survived in the communities descended from that land, says this. Martha heard the hammer cock behind her. She had spent her entire life learning to listen for danger the way the world had taught her to expect it from every direction. And in that half-second before the shot, she threw herself sideways, pulling Elias down with her. The shot went wide, splintering the wood of the post, where the boy's wrists had been bound only seconds before. Ridley had no time for a second shot. Martha closed the distance in a single stride, and rather than going for his gun hand, the obvious expected move, she drove her palm upward into the underside of his jaw with the full force of her body behind it. A strike Naomi had once called the sleeping blow, reserved for moments when there was no time left for anything gentler. Ridley's head snapped back. His knees buckled. He was unconscious before he hit the ground, the pistol falling from his fingers into the dirt beside him. The yard fell silent. 9 men, 3 unconscious outright, 2 more doubled over, unable to stand, 1 gasping for breath he couldn't find, 1 who had fled toward the main house, 1 bruised and shaken backing away with his hands raised, and Ridley, the last and most dangerous of them all, lying still in the dirt at Martha's feet. The entire confrontation, start to finish, had lasted somewhere between 90 seconds and 3 minutes, depending on which telling you hear. A span of time so brief that several witnesses, questioned separately in the days that followed by other supervisor desperate to understand what had happened, gave wildly different accounts of its length, each insisting the fight had felt both impossibly fast and impossibly long at the same time. That is what real violence does to memory. It compresses and stretches in the same breath, leaving behind an experience no clock could ever accurately measure. She stood in the center of that yard, chest heaving, blood on her knuckles that wasn't her own, and for the first time in more than 20 years of forced silence, Martha Johnson understood exactly what her body had always been capable of. She had never wanted to be a symbol. She had only wanted a boy's wrists free of rope. But standing there, surrounded by the wreckage of 9 armed men who had believed her incapable of resistance, she became something the property system had no name for and no answer to. And she knew, standing there in that sudden, ringing silence, that whatever came next, there was no version of her life that could go back to what had been an hour before. The fold that had held her pain for 27 years had finally, completely come undone. There was only forward now, only the tree line, only the choice between the harsh treatment post and the wilderness. She chose the wilderness. What Martha did next is, in many ways, the part of the story that reveals the most about who she truly was. Because a woman capable of that kind of violence in defense of a child was also, in the very same breath, capable of extraordinary restraint. She did not kill a single man in that yard. Every supervisor she struck down was left alive, beaten, humiliated, several of them badly injured, but alive. Later accounts from the property suggest this was not mercy born of weakness, but calculation. Martha understood, even in the heat of that fight, that a dead white supervisor in Georgia in 1832 would have brought a level of retribution down on every worker person on that property that no act of resistance could ever justify. She fought to survive and to free the boy. She did not fight to become a martyr for a cause that would cost others their lives. With the yard in chaos, and the man who had run for the main house not yet returned with reinforcements, Martha made the only decision left to her. She lifted Elias onto her back, told the stunned onlookers to return to their cabins and say nothing, and ran. She ran into the pine forest that bordered the eastern edge of the property. The same forest she had spent years, quietly memorizing every deer trail, every creek crossing, every hollow log large enough to hide a body, without ever knowing exactly why she was memorizing it. Only that some part of her had always understood a day like this might come. What followed was 11 hours that the oral history has never fully agreed upon in every detail, but agrees upon in spirit. A desperate flight through unfamiliar darkness, a woman carrying an injured child on her back through briar and creek and swamp, evading a search party that Klein organized within the hour, torches bobbing through the trees behind them like a slow, moving constellation of fury. The first hour was the most dangerous, and Martha knew it. Klein's property sat within shouting distance of 2 neighboring properties, both of which kept their own supervisor armed and their own hunting dogs kenneled and ready. If the alarm reached those dogs before she put real distance between herself and the yard, the pine forest that had always felt like sanctuary to her would become a trap instead, dense, echoing, impossible to disappear into with a dog on her scent. She moved fast in those first minutes, faster than she had ever moved, carrying a grown child's weight. Following the deer trail she had walked 100 times in her mind long before her feet ever touched it in the dark. Elias, in shock, in pain from the rope burns on his wrists, said nothing. He simply held on, his face pressed against her shoulder, trusting her the way only a child who has just watched the impossible happen can trust another person. Behind them, the property had come fully alive. Klein himself, roused from the main house, was already organizing the search. Every supervisor who could still stand, several armed neighbors summoned by messenger, and worst of all, the dogs. It was somewhere in that first hour, according to the version of the story told most consistently across the generations, that Martha reached the creek that marked the boundary of land she had ever set foot on before. Beyond it was unknown country, no memorized trail, no familiar hollow log, nothing but darkness and instinct. She did not hesitate. She waded directly into the cold water, moving upstream rather than across, forcing her own trail to run against the current for nearly a quarter-mile before she finally climbed out on the same bank she'd entered from, a maneuver meant to break any scent the dogs might pick up, to make the water itself lie to her pursuers about which direction she had gone. It was brutally cold, the kind of cold that steals the breath from your chest and the strength from your legs. And she did it anyway. Again and again through the night at every creek and drainage she crossed, because she understood something the search party would only realize hours too late. A woman that size carrying a child moving through unfamiliar wilderness should have been easy to catch. The only reason she wasn't was because she refused to move like a woman running blind. She moved like a woman who had already fought this battle 1,000 times in her head. Somewhere around the 2nd or 3rd hour, the dogs picked up what little scent remained on dry ground, and for a stretch of time that must have felt endless to Martha and the boy on her back, the baying of hounds carried through the trees behind them, rising and falling with the wind, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, never quite gone. It was in this stretch that the story takes one of its most quietly remarkable turns. Rather than simply running blind in terror, Martha used the wilderness itself as a weapon the way she had once used her own body against 9 armed men, turning the search party's numbers and their tools against them. She led the dogs toward a stretch of dense briar thicket she had once stumbled across while foraging years before. Wide enough to slow grown men on foot, but narrow enough that she and the boy, smaller and more careful in their movements, could pick a path through it that cost them blood and torn skin, but cost the men behind them far more time. By the 4th hour, The baying had fallen distant enough that she allowed herself, for the first time since the yard, a few minutes of complete stillness, pressed into the hollow beneath an uprooted tree, Elias shivering against her chest, both of them holding their breath as torchlight flickered somewhere through the trees, moving past without ever finding them. In that stillness, she did one more thing Naomi had taught her, a trick meant for exactly this kind of moment. She rubbed crushed pine needles and wet earth across both their skin, masking their scent as best she could with the smell of the forest itself. It was a small thing, almost nothing, the kind of detail that rarely survives in the grander retellings of a legend. But it was these small things, stacked one on top of another through the night, that made the difference between capture and freedom. Patience over panic. Preparation over hope, every single time. The hours after that blurred together in every version of the story, the way exhaustion blurs everything into a single unbroken stretch of cold and ache and forward motion. Martha's arms, already sore from the fight in the yard, screamed with the effort of carrying Elias's weight for mile after mile. Her feet, bare or barely shod depending on which telling you hear, bled from stone and root and thorn. She did not stop. She could not stop. Stopping meant the torches behind her would finally close the distance that her river crossings and her briar thickets had bought her. There is one scene from this stretch of the night that appears in some form in nearly every version of the story ever told, different in its small details depending on the teller, but consistent in its core. Somewhere past the halfway point, exhausted past the edge of what either of them thought they could endure, Martha and Elias came upon a shallow cave cut into a hillside, barely large enough for the two of them to crouch inside. She made the decision to stop, not because the danger had passed, but because she understood something Naomi had once told her about the body's limits. Even the strongest animal, pushed too far without rest, eventually collapses at the worst possible moment. Better to steal 20 minutes of stillness on her own terms than to be forced into stillness by her own exhaustion when it mattered most. In that cave, in the cold and the dark, with the distant sound of hounds rising and falling somewhere behind them, Elias finally spoke for the first time since the yard, a small, frightened whisper asking whether they were going to make it. Martha's answer, passed down through generations exactly as it was supposedly first spoken, was simple. We already made it. Everything after this is just walking. She told him in the quiet minutes that followed about Naomi, about the training in the dark between the cabins, about a lifetime of swallowed pain that had finally found somewhere to go. She did not tell him these things to frighten him further, but because she understood, even in the middle of her own desperate flight, that this boy was going to carry a piece of this night with him for the rest of his life. And she wanted him to carry the right piece, not fear, but proof. Proof that the property grip could be broken. Proof that someone had done it with nothing but her own 2 hands and 20 years of preparation nobody had known to watch for. 20 minutes later, she rose, lifted him back onto her shoulders, despite the screaming protest of muscles that had been pushed for nearly 6 hours straight, and kept walking. While Martha ran, the quarters she left behind were living through their own kind of terror. Klein had ordered every workers confined to their cabins under armed guard the moment the search party rode out, terrified that Martha's act of resistance might spark something larger, a fear that gripped nearly every slaveholder in the antebellum South in the years following the widely publicized rebellion attempts that had rocked the region just months before. Guards patrolled between the cabins through the night, muskets loaded, nerves frayed, jumping at every sound the darkness offered. Inside those cabins, the worker community held its own vigil, separate from the search happening in the woods, but no less intense. Elias's mother, permitted at last to grieve openly now that the guard's attention was elsewhere, wept quietly for the son she did not yet know had survived. Elders gathered in low murmurs, trading fragments of what they had witnessed in the yard, already beginning, even in that first terrified night, to shape the raw chaos of the event into something that could be carried forward, a story, a lesson, a name. It is worth pausing on this, because it says something important about how a moment like this becomes a legend in the first place. Legends are not simply born in the instant they happen. They are built deliberately and carefully in the hours and days immediately afterward by the people who witnessed them and understood, almost instinctively, that the moment needed to be preserved exactly because the people in power were going to try so hard to erase it. By the time the guards finally stood down at dawn, the version of the story that would be told for generations had already begun taking its first shape, whispered cabin to cabin in the dark. By the 9th and 10th hours, the search party exhausted themselves, several of its members still nursing the injuries Martha had given them in the yard. The dogs, footsore and confused by hours of false trails, had begun to fall back, unwilling to press further into unfamiliar country as dawn approached. Martha did not know this. She kept moving as though the torches were still at arm's length behind her. Because stopping to hope was a luxury a hunted person could not yet afford. She used everything Naomi had ever taught her, not just the fighting, but the listening. She knew how to move so that her footfalls didn't carry sound the way panicked footfalls do. She knew how to cross water to break a scent trail, a trick some of the older field hands had spoken of in hushed voices, techniques carried down from those among them who remembered life before bondage, when survival in dense wilderness had been an inherited skill rather than a desperate improvisation. By the first gray light of dawn, the search party had lost her trail entirely. Somewhere in the hills east of the property, a woman who had spent her whole life being told her body existed only for someone else's profit, finally stood still in the pale morning light. Alone with a child, she had refused to let the whip touch, and understood that for the first time in 27 years no one was watching her. Here the historical trail, as it has always been told in these communities, goes quiet, not because the story ends, but because the story was never meant to be traceable. A woman who had just crippled 9 armed men and vanished into the Georgia wilderness with a child on her back was not going to leave a record for the very people hunting her to follow. What happened to Elias is at least less contested among the different tellings. The boy was returned to the property within days, found wandering near a neighboring farm's boundary by a free black woodsman sympathetic to runaways who made certain the child was quietly guided back toward the direction of home, rather than toward capture by the search parties still combing the county. Martha, it seems, made the decision somewhere in that final stretch of the 11th hour that the boy's survival depended on separating from her, that a woman alone stood a far better chance of disappearing into unfamiliar country than a woman burdened with a child too young and too exhausted to keep pace much further. It is one of the story's quiet, aching details that the same act of fierce protection that began in the yard ended hours later in a deliberate goodbye in the dark. A boy pointed gently toward home while the woman who saved him kept walking alone into country she had never seen. Some versions of the story say Martha made her way north over the following weeks, moving only at night, surviving on what the land offered, and the quiet kindness of free black communities, and sympathetic strangers along hidden routes that would later become part of the broader network of resistance historians, now called the Underground Railroad. These tellings describe her passing through the Carolinas under cover of darkness, taken in for a time by a free black blacksmith's family who fed her and hid her in a root cellar for nearly 2 weeks, while the worst of the search efforts cooled. Some say she eventually reached Pennsylvania, took a new name, and lived out the rest of her days in relative peace, working as a laundress and later, some tellings insist, as a healer in her own right, carrying forward everything Naomi had taught her to a new generation of women who would never know the name Iron Rose, only the quiet, capable woman who taught them how to stand their ground. Other versions of the story, darker and more uncertain, suggest she was recaptured months later in a neighboring county, betrayed by a bounty hunter's dog after weeks of narrow escapes. Her fate afterward lost to time and the deliberate erasure that property owners were so practiced in when a story reflected poorly on the myth of their control. In these tellings, no further record survives, not because nothing happened to her, but because property owners across the region had every reason to make sure nothing more was ever written down. A recaptured woman who had beaten 9 armed men in open combat was not a story any slaveholder wanted circulating with an ending attached, triumphant or tragic. Silence in either direction served their purposes. The truth is that no single verified historical record confirms exactly what became of Martha Johnson after that night. And that uncertainty is, in its own way, part of what makes her story so enduring. She belongs not to a single verified document, but to an oral tradition carried forward across generations of descendants in that part of Georgia, passed down specifically because the people who lived under the same system she fought against needed her to be real, needed to know that resistance, total, physical, unflinching resistance, was possible even against 9 armed men who believed themselves untouchable. What we do know from the broader historical record of that era is that stories like hers were not isolated. Worker women across the antebellum South are documented in the words of formerly worker people, themselves recorded decades later, as having fought back against supervisors with hoes, with their bare hands, with whatever the moment offered them, biting, striking, refusing. Martha's story, whether every detail survived intact through a century of retelling or was shaped and sharpened by the generations who needed it most, sits within a very real, very documented pattern of resistance that history has too often minimized or erased entirely. Before we get to how her legend spread, there's one more thread worth pulling, because the 9 men who walked into that yard convinced of their own invincibility did not walk away from that day unchanged. Either Garrett Voss, the man who started it all by raising his whip against an 11-year-old boy, never fully recovered his standing among the other property supervisors in the county. The story of being the first man put on his back by a woman, no less, in front of dozens of witnesses, followed him for the rest of his career. According to the oral history, he left Klein's employment within the year, and some tellings say he left overseeing work entirely, unable to shake the reputation that trailed him from farm to farm. Thomas Ridley, the coldest and most dangerous of the 9, carried a different kind of mark. The blow that put him on the ground that day left him with headaches. By his own later complaints to other supervisors, that never fully went away. More than one telling of the story suggests that Ridley, of all 9 men, was the one who most quietly warned other supervisor in the years that followed never to underestimate an worker woman's capacity for violence in defense of a child, not out of any newfound respect for the people he still helped to brutalize, but out of pure, humiliated self-preservation. Klein himself, humiliated by the entire episode and terrified of what it might inspire among the rest of his workforce, tightened every rule on the property in the weeks that followed. Curfews grew stricter. Punishments grew harsher in a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to erase the story through fear alone. But fear, as Klein would eventually learn the way every enslaver who tried this approach eventually learned, cannot compete with a story that people need to believe. By the time the sun rose the morning after the confrontation, word of what happened in that yard had already begun spreading, carried in whispers from field to field, property to property, in the way news always traveled fastest through the very networks the worker were never supposed to have. Worker cooks who served breakfast in neighboring property kitchens overheard their owners discussing it in shocked, furious tones, and carried the details back to their own quarters by nightfall. Wagon drivers hauling cotton between farms passed the story along at crossroads and river landings. Within a week, versions of what happened in Klein's yard had reportedly reached worker communities 2 and 3 counties away, each retelling adding its own texture, its own detail, its own quiet embellishment born from the sheer human need to make the story a little bigger, a little more impossible, a little more proof that the impossible could actually happen. Klein, humiliated and furious, tried desperately to suppress the story. He forbade his workers from speaking of it under threat of punishment. He told visiting planters that the incident had been wildly exaggerated, that a single supervisor had merely stumbled and the others had overreacted. But you cannot silence 140 witnesses, and you certainly cannot silence 9 men nursing broken jaws, bruised ribs, and wounded pride in a county small enough that every doctor's visit became its own piece of evidence. The local physician who treated Voss's dislocated jaw and Ridley's concussion was, by more than one account, unable to keep the details to himself over drinks with other planters. And from there the story slipped entirely beyond Klein's control. Within the worker communities of that county, the story took on a life that no property owner could control. Some told it as pure defiance, a warning to supervisors everywhere that cruelty had a cost. Others told it as something closer to prophecy, a sign that the system built on the myth of total control had a crack in it wide enough for a single woman to walk through. Elders folded it into the same oral tradition that carried survival knowledge, spiritual practice, and family history forward across generations who were forbidden from reading or writing any of it down. It became, in effect, a kind of scripture, recited quietly, reverently, in the hours after the supervisors had gone to bed, and the quarters belonged, briefly, to the people who lived in them. Children who grew up in those quarters in the years that followed were raised on whispered versions of the story before they ever learned to read. Iron Rose, who fought 9 men and vanished into the trees. Iron Rose, who saved a boy from the harsh treatment post with her bare hands. Iron Rose, who proved that the property iron grip was never as unbreakable as it wanted worker people to believe. Mothers invoked her name to comfort frightened children during storms. Elders invoked her name during moments of despair, a reminder that endurance was not the same thing as surrender. By the time the Civil War finally arrived 3 decades later, versions of Martha's story were reportedly still being told in that part of Georgia, passed down to a generation who had never known her, who knew her only as a name and a night and a promise that resistance, however small, however costly, was never entirely futile. And that, in the end, is the real power of her story, not the precise details of a single night that no official record was ever allowed to preserve, but the truth underneath it, the truth that generations of worker and formerly worker people, insisted on keeping alive because they needed it. The truth that resistance was possible, that the body worked to exhaustion in the fields, could also become the body that refused, the body that fought back, the body that walked into the trees and was never dragged back to that post again. There is a particular detail that appears in several of the more detailed tellings of the story, one worth including here because of what it reveals about how thoroughly the legend embedded itself into the culture of that region. In the decades following the confrontation, it is said that worker women on property throughout that part of Georgia began invoking Martha's name. Not always by her given name, but by the title the quarters had given her in the moments just before facing punishment themselves. A kind of quiet invocation, a reminder to themselves that endurance and defiance were not opposites, that a person could hold both at once and still survive. Whether this detail reflects something that genuinely happened or something added later by tellers who understood exactly what the story needed to carry forward, it speaks to the same truth either way. Martha's name became a tool, a piece of armor passed hand to hand, the same way Naomi had once passed her knowledge to Martha in the dark. Here's something worth sitting with before we close this out, because it's the piece of the story that turns Iron Rose from a single remarkable woman into something much larger. A thread in a pattern that historians are only now beginning to fully document. For generations, the dominant narrative of American slavery painted the worker as largely passive victims of a system too total, too violent, too well armed to meaningfully resist. That narrative was never true, and it was never accidental. It served the interests of the people who built and profited from that system to have history remember. The enslaved as broken rather than resistant, as suffering rather than fighting back. But the actual record, the interviews conducted decades later with formerly enslaved people, the court documents, the property correspondence that occasionally let the truth slip through, tells a very different story. Enslaved women in particular have too often been left out of the story of resistance altogether, remembered by history primarily as victims of violence, rather than as people who met that violence with their own. But the accounts that survive tell us otherwise, again and again. Women who bit supervisors rather than submit to a beating. Women who swung a hoe with enough force to knock a grown man flat in the dirt. Women who fought, in the words of their own testimony decades later, not because they believed they could always win, but because submission had stopped being a choice they were willing to make. Historians studying interviews conducted with formerly enslaved people decades after emancipation have documented case after case of exactly this kind of resistance. Women who seized a hoe and struck down a supervisor who threatened them. Women who fought back with their bare hands against beatings. Women whose defiance was recorded almost as an afterthought in transcripts, otherwise focused on other aspects of their lives, as though the interviewers themselves didn't fully grasp how remarkable those moments truly were. These were not isolated incidents. They were a pattern so consistent across property, across states, across decades, that historians today argue the popular image of total, unbroken submission under slavery was never an accurate reflection of what actually happened. It was a story slaveholders told about themselves, and one that later generations of history books, written largely without input from the descendants of the enslaved, simply repeated without question. Martha's story, however, it survived the retelling across nearly 2 centuries. However, many details were sharpened or softened by the generations who needed to keep alive, sits inside that very real, very human pattern. It is a story about a single night in a single yard in central Georgia. Yes, But it is also a story about every enslaved woman whose name never survived at all, whose moment of defiance was never passed down around a fire, whose resistance disappeared into the same silence that swallowed so much of what was done to an entire people. That is why stories like this matter even, especially when the precise historical record cannot confirm every detail. Because the alternative to telling them is a silence that serves no one except the people who benefited from making sure they were never told in the first place. We may never know with certainty every detail of what happened in that Georgia property yard in 1832, the exact names, the exact numbers, the exact fate that awaited Martha Johnson beyond the tree line. What has survived, carried forward through generations of oral history rather than official record, is something arguably more powerful than any single verified fact. The memory of a woman who refused, absolutely and completely, to accept that her body and her spirit belonged to anyone but herself. Think about what that refusal actually required. Not a single moment of rage. Anyone can manage that. It required 27 years of swallowed pain. Patiently building toward a readiness she may not have even fully understood she was building. It required a teacher willing to pass down forbidden knowledge in the dark at enormous personal risk on the chance that one day her student might need it. It required a woman to look at 9 armed men and a locked, violent system stacked entirely against her and decide in a single heartbeat that a child's safety was worth every possible consequence. And then it required something even harder than the fight itself, 11 hours of relentless, bleeding, freezing endurance through unfamiliar wilderness powered by nothing but will. That is not a story about one impossible night. It's a story about what happens when patience, preparation, and love finally meet the moment that demands them. Stories like hers remind us why oral history matters, because the official record of slavery in America was written almost entirely by the people who benefited from it, while the truth of resistance, courage, and defiance was carried instead in whispers, in memory, around fires, from grandmother to granddaughter for nearly 2 centuries, until stories like this one could finally be told out loud to you today. Somewhere in central Georgia, the pine forest Martha Johnson vanished into that morning, still stands or something like it does, reshaped by 200 years of logging and farming and time, but rooted in the same red clay that once bore the weight of a woman who refused to be broken. No monument marks the spot. No plaque tells her story. The only place she has ever truly survived is in the telling. In exactly this, one more voice carrying her name forward, one more generation, refusing the same way she once refused to let it disappear. Descendants of the free black community scattered across that stretch of Georgia still trade fragments of the story today, sitting on porches, at family reunions, in the pauses between other conversations, the same way it has always been passed, not as a lecture, not as a lesson, but as something closer to inheritance. A grandmother leans forward. A child leans in to listen. And somewhere in that small, quiet exchange, Iron Rose fights her way out of that yard all over again, exactly as she did the first time, refusing once more to be forgotten. If this story moved you, if it made you sit up a little straighter, if it reminded you of the price so many paid for freedom we too often take for granted, that's exactly why it was never allowed to be forgotten. And if you're new to Estate Aikido Turaman, make sure you like and subscribe and turn on notifications. Every story we share shines a light on forgotten struggles, acts of resistance, and remarkable individuals whose voices were nearly lost to history. By watching, sharing, and discussing these stories, you help keep their memories alive. Thank you for watching and for keeping her memory, and the memory of everyone like her alive.